A cloud of suspicion surrounds the deaths of Oscar-winning actor Gene Hackman and his wife, whose bodies were found in their Santa Fe home.
There was a house in the high desert outside Santa Fe, New Mexico, where the wind came down from the Sangre Mountains and moved through the piñon trees with a sound that could almost be mistaken for breathing. From a distance, there was nothing particularly extraordinary about the place. Its adobe walls carried the muted color of dried clay, blending naturally into the surrounding desert, while a long gravel driveway disappeared behind a private gate. Cottonwoods stood around the property, turning brilliant gold in October before surrendering their leaves to the winter wind. It was the kind of landscape where silence did not feel empty. It felt permanent. And for decades, this quiet, isolated property belonged to one of the most recognizable men in the world, a man whose face had appeared before millions of people across 6 continents, yet who eventually chose to disappear from that world almost completely. That man was Gene Hackman. For much of his career, he had lived in the exact opposite environment from the one he eventually chose. Hollywood had given him flashing cameras, crowded sets, premieres, interviews, awards, and the constant presence of strangers who believed they knew him because they had watched him become someone else on a screen. He had won 2 Academy Awards and appeared in more than 100 films over 5 decades, playing detectives, villains, coaches, military officers, criminals, and complicated men whose emotions were often buried beneath layers of restraint. But sometime around the turn of the millennium, something changed. Hackman did not gradually fade into retirement with one final publicity tour or a carefully staged farewell. He simply stopped. He said he was finished, and then, remarkably, he behaved as though he meant it. He left behind the machinery of Hollywood and retreated into a landscape where the loudest thing most days was the wind moving across the desert. In New Mexico, the famous actor slowly became something almost unrecognizable compared with the man audiences remembered. He wrote novels. He painted. He rode his bicycle through town. He handled ordinary errands himself. He lived a life stripped of many of the things that had once surrounded him. There were no red carpets waiting at the end of the driveway, no crowds gathering outside his home, no constant demand for another interview or another performance. Instead, there were long roads, open skies, desert light, and the deliberate privacy of a man who had spent decades being watched and had finally decided that he wanted to be unseen. Over the years, the property began to feel less like a celebrity residence and more like a private world carefully constructed around one person's idea of peace. The walls were thick, the views were open, the gate remained closed, and almost everything about the property seemed designed to create distance between the man inside and the world beyond it. The people who knew the area understood the broad outline of his life, but very few could claim to know what happened behind those walls. They knew Hackman valued his privacy. They knew he could be courteous without being accessible. They knew that the property was secluded, and that he had chosen the location precisely because it offered something Hollywood never could: distance. But beneath the floors of that quiet home, according to the story that would eventually emerge, there was something almost nobody knew about. There was a passage. A set of steps descended from a lower level into the earth, leading away from the ordinary rooms above. It was not the kind of feature that announced itself. There was no grand entrance, no dramatic stone arch, no sign telling visitors that something unusual waited below. Instead, there was simply a door, plain enough to be ignored, the kind of door most people might assume led to a utility room, storage space, or mechanical area. But behind that door, the story claimed, the floor disappeared downward. Concrete steps descended into cooler air and darkness, and beyond them was a passage that seemed to extend farther than anyone would expect from looking at the house above. That simple door became the image around which the entire mystery formed. Imagine walking through an ordinary lower room, surrounded by the practical machinery of a desert home, and noticing a door that seems completely unremarkable. You open it expecting pipes, storage, or perhaps nothing interesting at all. Instead, you discover stairs disappearing into the earth. Suddenly, the ordinary house becomes something else. The mind begins asking questions almost immediately. Why was it built? Where did it go? Who used it? And perhaps the most important question of all, why would a man who had spent years trying to keep the world away from him need a hidden way to go even deeper into the earth? For years, the existence of that passage lived somewhere between fact and rumor. In a small community, especially one surrounding a famous but intensely private person, stories have a way of growing in the spaces where information is missing. Contractors talk. Workers remember unusual details. Neighbors hear fragments. One person mentions a lower room. Another remembers construction work. And eventually those fragments become a story much larger than the original facts. Some versions suggested that the passage might have been a Cold War-era bomb shelter, reinforced beneath the property in case the world outside suddenly became dangerous. Others imagined a private wine cellar, buried underground where the temperature could remain stable. Still others believed it might have been some kind of access tunnel, perhaps extending beneath the driveway and toward the desert beyond the property. The more mysterious the man became, the more mysterious the tunnel seemed. That was the strange relationship between Hackman's privacy and the stories surrounding his home. The less people saw, the more they imagined. A closed gate became a symbol. A quiet road became evidence that something was being hidden. A door beneath the house became an invitation for the imagination to fill in everything nobody could actually see. Some versions became increasingly dramatic, imagining a secret escape route or a hidden chamber where a famous man could disappear without ever passing through the front entrance. But there was a problem with all of those stories. For a long time, nobody could prove anything. There were whispers, guesses, and fragments of local conversation, but no clear answer. The tunnel existed in the imagination long before anyone could explain what it actually was. And then, eventually, the doors of the house had to be opened by people other than the man who had spent decades controlling who entered them. That changed everything. The property that had once been intensely private suddenly became a place that others had to examine, room by room. People whose responsibility was not to speculate but to observe could finally walk through spaces that had remained inaccessible for years. They could see the walls, the floors, the doors, the lower rooms, and the structures that had previously existed only in rumor. And when they reached the plain door in the lower level and opened it, the story changed in an instant. The rumor was no longer something that lived entirely in whispered conversations. There were physical steps. There was a real passage. There was a structure that could be examined and described. The question was no longer whether there was something beneath the house. The question became much more interesting. What did it mean? To understand that question, however, you have to go much farther back than the desert. You have to go back before the awards, before Hollywood, before the quiet house in New Mexico, and before Gene Hackman became the man millions of people recognized. You have to go back to Illinois, to a childhood shaped by instability, and to a boy who learned very early that the people who were supposed to remain in your life could sometimes disappear without warning. Long before he became an actor, before anyone knew his name, he was Eugene, a teenager trying to understand a world that seemed to change without asking his permission. And one particular moment would stay with him for years. He was only 13 when his father drove past him on the street, lifted one hand from the steering wheel in a small wave, and continued driving. There was no dramatic confrontation, no long explanation, no final conversation that gave the boy a satisfying reason for what was happening. There was simply a vehicle moving away and a hand disappearing from view. For a child, moments like that can become larger than they appear to adults. A simple goodbye can become a lesson about permanence. A person leaving can become proof that nobody is guaranteed to stay. Hackman would later describe that experience as something that affected him deeply, as though a door had closed somewhere inside him. From that point forward, the idea of being abandoned, being trapped, or being left without control would become part of the emotional landscape he carried into adulthood. A boy who learns such a lesson early may begin constructing his life around never being powerless again. At 16, Hackman lied about his age and joined the Marines, stepping into an environment that offered something his childhood had not: structure. The military had rules, it had routines, it had boundaries. There were clear expectations about where you stood, what you were supposed to do, and what happened next. For a young man searching for stability, that kind of structure could be powerful. Hackman worked as a radio operator and was stationed in places including China, Japan, and Hawaii. He learned how to listen carefully, how to distinguish meaningful signals from static, and how information moved through channels that most people never noticed. At first, that may seem unrelated to the story of a house in the New Mexico desert decades later. But when you look at the shape of his life as a whole, the connection becomes harder to ignore. Because Gene Hackman's life repeatedly revolved around control, distance, observation, and the ability to decide what came through and what stayed outside. After leaving the Marines, he struggled to find a direction. He tried different kinds of work, including journalism and television production, but success did not come easily. Acting, too, was not an immediate triumph. He was older than many of the students around him and carried the uncomfortable feeling that he was already behind. Then came rejection, the kind that can convince a person that perhaps the world has already made its decision about them. At one point, an instructor ranked the students according to their apparent potential, and Hackman ended up at the bottom. Dead last, the least promising, the one least likely to succeed. For many people, a moment like that might become a reason to quit. For Hackman, it became something else. It became fuel. The boy who had watched his father drive away without explanation eventually became a man determined not to allow other people to define his limits. He would decide for himself when he was finished. He would decide where he lived. He would decide when the public could see him. And perhaps most importantly, he would decide when the door opened and when it stayed closed. It took years before the world caught up with him. But eventually, in his mid-30s, everything changed. The actor who had once been considered the least promising began receiving serious attention. Roles that might have passed unnoticed became turning points. Suddenly, the man who had been ranked last was being discussed as one of the most compelling actors of his generation. Then came the detective, the trench coat, the pork pie hat, and the unforgettable chase that helped redefine what audiences believed an action sequence could be. Gene Hackman had arrived. Awards followed. More films followed. His face became internationally recognizable. The boy who had once stood beside a road watching his father disappear eventually stood on a stage holding an Academy Award. From the outside, it looked like the perfect conclusion to a story about perseverance. The rejected actor had proven everyone wrong. The forgotten boy had become a star. The man who had been told he might never make it had reached the highest level of his profession. But success does not automatically erase the lessons of childhood. Sometimes it simply gives a person more resources with which to build around them. Hackman continued working for decades, appearing in more than 100 films and portraying men who often carried their own private tensions beneath controlled exteriors. Then, Sometime around the beginning of the new millennium, he made a decision that was almost impossible for someone of his stature to make. He stopped. There was no desperate attempt to remain relevant, no endless search for one final iconic role. He simply walked away from the machinery that had made him famous, and instead of replacing Hollywood with another form of public life, he moved toward almost complete privacy. That is what makes the house in New Mexico so important to the story. It was not simply a place where an actor happened to retire. It represented the final expression of a pattern that had existed throughout his life. The boy who had learned that people could leave had become a man who controlled his own exits. The young Marine who found comfort in structure became a private man, living behind gates and walls. The actor who had spent decades being watched eventually chose a place where he could go days without being noticed at all. And beneath that house, if the story is to be believed, was a room where the world above became distant, where the entrance could be controlled, and where a person could retreat from everything beyond the walls. The tunnel, then, begins to look less like a mystery about hidden treasure, and more like a physical expression of something that had been present in Hackman's life for decades. Perhaps the most interesting question was never what he was hiding beneath the house. Perhaps it was what he had spent his entire life trying to protect. His privacy, his independence, his ability to choose, his right to close the door when the outside world became too loud. And if that interpretation is correct, then the passage beneath the house was not necessarily the beginning of the mystery. It was the final chapter of one that had begun when a 13-year-old boy watched a car disappear down an Illinois street and quietly decided that, from then on, he would have to build his own walls. The man who would one day build a hidden passage beneath his own house spent his young adulthood learning how information travels, how it can be intercepted, and how a person who understands those channels can control what other people are allowed to hear. At the time, there was no reason to believe that lesson would matter decades later. He was simply a young man trying to find his place after leaving the Marines, carrying with him the discipline of military life, but still searching for something that felt like his own. When he came out of the service, he drifted the way many young men did in those years. He tried journalism. He tried television production. He tested different paths, hoping one of them might finally open. But by his own admission, he was not obviously good at any of it, and the rejection began piling up in a way that would have crushed most people. There is a story he told for decades, one with the polished shine of something repeated many times. But at its center, it appears to capture something important about the man he was becoming. He was studying acting in California, older than many of the other students, and already carrying the uncomfortable feeling that he was behind, that time was moving faster than he was. Then an instructor at the school ranked the students according to their potential, putting a number on failure and making the judgment official. Hackman ended up at the very bottom. Dead last, the least promising student in the group, the one who, according to that assessment, was least likely to make it. For someone already wondering whether he had arrived too late, the ranking could have been devastating. Instead, he carried it with him, not necessarily on paper, but in the deeper place where people store the experiences that become fuel. It became one more reason to prove that other people's judgments did not have the final word. Because if there was one thread running from the boy standing on that street in Illinois to the older man who would eventually disappear into the New Mexico desert, it was this. Gene Hackman did not trust anyone else to decide what he was worth. And he certainly did not intend to let anyone else decide when he was finished. He would make his own terms. He would build his own walls. And whenever the world tried to tell him what he could or could not become, he would answer by continuing forward until the world had no choice but to notice. Eventually, he would build a life where the decisions were his alone, on land he owned, behind gates he controlled, in a place where he could choose when the outside world was allowed to reach him. But getting there took time. It took him until his mid-30s to finally break through, which was brutally late, in an industry that worships youth and constantly searches for the next new face. Yet, when the breakthrough came, it came with a force that seemed to erase the years of rejection almost overnight. He landed a role as the older brother of a small-time hood in a film about two doomed outlaws, and suddenly, the actor who had once been ranked last was the actor everyone was talking about. The industry that had dismissed him began paying attention. The opportunities multiplied. The face that had once been overlooked became impossible to ignore. Then came the detective, the pork pie hat, the trench coat, the relentless pursuit, the reckless car chase beneath the elevated tracks that changed the way audiences thought an action sequence could be filmed. Hackman had become the kind of actor who could dominate a scene without needing to explain himself. He won the industry's highest honors, and the boy, whose father had once waved from a departing car, eventually stood on a stage holding a golden statue. From the outside, it looked like the perfect ending to the story. The rejection had been defeated. The judgment had been proven wrong. The boy who had been left behind had finally arrived. But you would think that would be the end of it, the proof that finally settled everything. It wasn't. It rarely is for people who have spent their formative years learning that nothing is permanent. Applause is loud, but it does not last. Awards gather dust. Crowds move on. The cameras eventually point somewhere else, and when the noise fades, old fears can return with surprising strength. The fear that everything can be taken away. The fear that the people celebrating you today may turn around and disappear tomorrow. The fear that a door can close without warning, just as it had when he was a boy. So even at the height of his career, even as he became one of the most recognizable faces in the world, Gene Hackman seemed to be building a life designed around exits. On film sets, he was known as someone who could turn on a dime, generous and warm one moment, intensely private, and closed the next. Directors learned to give him room. Co-stars learned to read the atmosphere around him. He did not respond well to being managed, handled, or told what he was supposed to do. And in interviews he sometimes appeared almost puzzled by his own success, as though the fame belonged to another person, and he had simply been passing through it. But beneath that modesty was something harder and more watchful. He was always, in some part of himself, calculating the distance to the door. For 3 decades, he worked relentlessly, appearing in more than 100 films and playing villains, lawmen, coaches, admirals, fathers, criminals, and men whose greatest struggles often remained hidden beneath the surface. He became a master at portraying people who were carrying something they refused to reveal. Perhaps that was part of why audiences believed him. He understood the power of silence. He understood what a person could communicate by withholding something rather than saying it aloud. And then, sometime in the early 2000s, he did the thing almost no one in his position ever manages to do. He stopped. Not with a slow fade, not with a desperate sequence of increasingly smaller roles, but with a decision that was remarkably simple. He was done, and he was done. There was no farewell tour, no carefully orchestrated announcement designed to keep his name in the headlines. He simply walked away from the loudest life imaginable and went searching for the quietest one he could find. It was as though, After spending decades being watched by millions, he had finally decided that the only role left worth playing was himself, somewhere far away from the cameras. He found that life in the high desert of New Mexico, in a landscape of sagebrush, red rock, dry air, and enormous silence. It was a world almost perfectly opposite to Hollywood. There were no crowds pressing against barricades, no photographers waiting outside restaurants, no studio executives calling with another script. The nearest neighbor could feel like a rumor, and at night the sky opened above the desert with more stars than most people living in cities ever see. The silence was not the absence of something. It was the presence of something he had spent much of his life searching for. The house itself seemed to belong to that landscape. It sat low on a rise, adobe-colored and deliberately understated, built to disappear into the earth rather than announce itself against it. Thick walls protected the interior from the desert heat and cold. Deep windows framed long views across the surrounding land. From inside, someone could see a considerable distance in almost every direction. Anyone approaching the property would have to cross the open landscape before reaching the house. There was time to see them coming. There was time to decide what to do. Nothing happened suddenly, and perhaps that was not accidental. Everything about the property seemed to reflect the principle that had governed him since that afternoon in Illinois when he was 13 years old. No one gets in unless I let them in. No one decides when I am seen. No one decides when I leave. Those were not written rules. They did not need to be. They were embedded in the way he lived. The gate, the long road, the distance, the walls, the quiet. Each one created another layer between the private man inside and the public world outside. And into this fortress of quiet, at the end of a long private road, he brought the final chapter of his life. His privacy, his painting, his writing, his bicycles, his long walks, and the ordinary routines that had become more valuable to him than almost anything Hollywood could offer. For years, that was all the outside world could see. A closed gate, an empty road, a famous man who had become almost invisible. But beneath the finished floors of that quiet home was something else, something almost nobody knew was there. A set of concrete steps leading downward, away from the sunlight and into the earth. And that is where the story begins to change. Because the question was no longer why a famous actor had retired. The question was, why, after spending his entire life building distance between himself and the world, he had built one more layer of distance beneath his own home.